Hello, colleagues, and welcome to our next episode of DINCast, whereby this time we're going to be rethinking about how we lead with the brilliant Professor Dave Snowden from the Carnarvon Company. Did I pronounce that right, Dave?
Carnarvon Company.
Carnarvon Company, right. Thank you very much for keeping me right, sir. But delighted that we've got some of your time today. And we're going to sort of talk around a whole range of issues which you've got published research on, and I've seen a lot of your video presentations as well. And I think it's a fascinating sort of subject to sort of bring towards social housing leaders. But for those people who've not heard about you before, do you want to tell us a little bit briefly about your history and how you've got to where you are?
Oh, so history is many and various. I actually worked in the World Council of Churches program to combat racism for several years after university, where I graduated with physics and philosophy, which was an interesting combination. Then I had a career in initially HR accounting, building decision support systems for the like of Guinness PLC. And then IBM bought the company. By then I was strategy director, and I got put in a freelance sort of do whatever you want as long as it's interesting role. That worked for 7 years. And then 20 years ago now, I left IBM and set up the Carnarvon Co, really to focus on using natural science to understand social systems.
And why did you feel sort of a need to sort of do that in terms of, in a crowded world of sort of leadership and management sort of thinking?
Oh, because I lived through all the nonsensical fad cycles. So, we were re-engineered, we were blue ocean, we were learned. I mean, and it was kind of like, guys, every time we do this, you've got a theory based on very similar case studies. So I started to challenge the whole case-based approach to management science. And of course, with a scientific background, you do that anyway, because, from a physics point of view, no social scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion anyway. And what you actually get with the case is two major problems. One is the confusion of correlation with causation. Yeah, but the other one is the cases, as the context changes, the cases are irrelevant anyway. So you need a different basis.
And that's a point I'd love to pick up, because I mean, we have a lot of case studies within the social housing sector, and I think people look to them as some sort of magic silver bullet. Oh, they're having a similar problem to us. Can you just explain to us what some of the myths are around sort of?
The cases are useful, all right, but if you think any case before COVID is more or less irrelevant now in post-COVID, yeah, and that's a major one where it's fairly obvious, but more subtly. Our approach is very different. We say, let's look at what we know from natural science about the way human beings make decisions, about the way systems work. Then we'll develop methods and tools consistent with those principles, and that takes about 5 to 6 years on average. And then 3 to 4 years of experimental work to actually find out how those work in practice, but consistent with the theory. Now, you can then use cases to illustrate the approach, but what you've then got is something which scales to different contexts. So, the way human beings make decisions is not going to happen within our lifetime substantially. Yeah. So we know a famous case on this. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays, on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. You ask the radiologist to look for anomalies, 83% will not see it. So any approach to leadership or decision making, which assumes, we'll make rational decisions if we have the right information, is fundamentally flawed from day one.
And yet, why do we as leaders not sort of, think about, your approach and sort of adopt that? We seem to be sort of stuck in a very, very traditional way of leading organizations.
It's a 20, 30-year-old thing. It came in with systems thinking. I mean, I taught leadership with Peter Drucker. If you actually look at leadership in scientific management period, it's actually incremental. Most people stayed in one company for life. They ran apprentice models. Human judgment was a key part of the system. What happens in the 80s and 90s, and it's triggered by two things: business process re-engineering and Sengi's learning organization, so the hard and the soft side, both of which come from an engineering metaphor, both of which assume you can design the perfect system rather than let it evolve. So these things go through their cycle. I mean, we've now switched since COVID from having to explain why we do things. Now people just take it for granted we can do them and want to know what it will do for them. And that's how cycles change. So I think we're in a different period now.
And sort of taking that, and I think we spoke about this on the sort of the briefing call, that the sort of industrial design of systems and processes, what sort of challenges do you come across trying to move them into, say, a service organization?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the danger is methods are developed in a manufacturing environment, which is a closed system, and taken across into a service environment, which is an open system. And you can't do that. But then even within a manufacturing environment, if you look at the Gemba approach, which we've done a lot with, from Japanese manufacturing, there are complex human behavioral aspects, even within a closed system, that you need to pay attention to. And the danger is we have an excessive desire for order and repetition. Ironically, none of us would apply the techniques we do in management to managing our families.
Yeah.
And that's the great irony, because actually we understand in day-to-day relationships with children and friends that the situation is complex, it's emergent, it's a matter of small probes, see what works, what doesn't work, changing the dispositional state so that children are more likely to behave well than badly. We know that rules don't work. And then guess what happens when we walk through the door of work? We suddenly impose rigid rules and we wonder why it doesn't work.
So what do we need to sort of do to sort of shake leaders out of this sort of old world sort of thinking? Because I mean, from a personal point of view, I thought COVID would be a burning platform for change. I'm seeing now we're going back to how things were before.
Hasn't it? Hasn't. All right. Part of the problem is people, a lot of people, and we had this argument with people in the NHS, the procurement became a lot easier during COVID. They assumed that would carry on post-COVID. And I was arguing, look, change the rules enough that people will be happy post-COVID, but they wouldn't. Then, of course, the only thing available post-COVID was rigid lockdown again. But we are seeing changes. So people are starting to shift away from the idea that there are competencies which are universal to leadership, whereas leadership is actually contextual. We're now doing work on distributed decision-making, in which we distribute decision-making authority into what are called entangled trios or combinations of roles with transparency and visibility, which actually get rid of 80 or 90% of the decisions a leader has to make by distributing to the network, and then the leader can focus on overall direction or goal, a strategy. So there are new techniques, there are new models, there are models which actually resonate with people more deeply. And we've gone from early adopters to early majority, if you know market life cycle theory. So for the last 10 or 15 years, we've been working with the 2.5% of the market who buy new things.
Yeah.
Right? We're now in the 13.5% who actually get first mover advantage from doing the new things. And that's where the market grows.
So obviously within a non-competitive environment through social housing, we have a slightly different sort of challenge around getting organizations to change. We tend to find that sort of, I suppose, what you would call corporate antibodies can actually, stop any real significant change going on. How do you overcome barriers to that?
Yeah, and I think that is an issue. So, for example, balanced scorecards have been abandoned in industry for about 15, 20 years because they don't help. But they're all over public sector and social housing. I mean, in fact, they're ontologically flawed. They really are bad, right? But the trouble is, if you have the commercial pressure of industrial companies forces bad things out of the system faster. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be the case in social housing. So if I take social housing, our work on engaging tenants in real-time decision-making is actually a small shift for companies to make. And what we don't want is for complexity theory or anthro-complexity or sense-making to become another fad. Because actually everything we've done to date has value. We just made it universal rather than contextual. So the way to do it, and we're up for, is we're now using, for example, tenants as journalists to capture quantitative data with narrative backup. We're distributing decision making to combinations of tenants with maintenance workers with some third party. So that you can actually get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy in the system and increase the deployment. And the fundamental principle on this is, in a highly complex environment, rules don't work because the context shifts so much. So you need process which can replace rules. And people are starting to realize that, but you don't get rid of the rules because the rules are still important in about 80% of what you do. It's just the 20% where you need something different.
So one of the challenges that we come across is that, particularly at leadership level, there is a disconnect, or there's a gap between what is actually happening on the front line with tenants and residents. So the levels of assurance and reassurance aren't necessarily there. And you've probably read the same tragedies that happened recently. How do we help leaders close that gap?
I was the principal author on the European Union Field Guide on how to manage complexity, which you can distribute to your members for free, because we're no longer in the European Union. They'll have to pay postage if they want a physical copy. Don't get me onto that one, all right? So that says a couple of things, all right? One is you need to actually use your employees or your tenants as a sensor network. And actually, that's quite easy to do, because if you're getting continuous real-time feedback loop from tenants, children of tenants, maintenance workers, you can spot good patterns to amplify and bad patterns to dampen very quickly. If you distribute decision-making, you can get a lot of small petty decisions out of the way, but actually in a more transparent, more audible process than if you actually try and delegate it. Yeah. If you then start to actually do experimental interventions involving combinations of people from different backgrounds, you can allow novel solutions to emerge. So it's not particularly difficult. The secret is not to say, we're going to throw out everything we've done today. You're going to say, what you need to say is, look, we got these intractable problems. We know, for example, that small decisions early on black mold might have removed the problem. But because it was a formal process, it delayed things too far. Yeah. It also meant that senior executives with legal responsibility didn't pick up on the weak signals because there were too many filtering levels between the field and the decision maker who has the legal liability. And that is a major issue. If you're sitting on the board of a housing association, you are now in deep shit legally and personally if you don't do it. Now, we can build systems which provide that data. The same is true if you look at Grenville, because I got involved in some of that, where they did a narrative approach post-Grenville, but then, of course, it wasn't the people who interpreted the narrative, it was the experts, and guess who the experts were paid by. And there's this concept of allowing people, it's called epistemic sovereignty, basically the authority to interpret their own experience, but in such a way that that is visible in a quantitative way, not a qualitative way, to senior executives. And that's been our focus for the last 10, 15, 20 years.
So just on picking up that point around data, because we quite often, hear various different phrases around sort of data being the new oil, gold, all of those sort of things. But it's traditionally sort of a lag measure, isn't it? And as a leader,
I think you've got two problems. One is when people talk about data and data analytics, they're talking about what can be written down or text. That's about 10% of what people know. So when we're doing, for example, we just did a big project with residential care homes in the Netherlands, where we've done continuous narrative capture from residents, relatives, children, and medical staff. But that's in a quantitative format. It was originally designed to supplement the operational systems. Actually, it's flipped because that has more value. Yeah. So what we're looking at is things from people's individual perspective at large scale, so that we've got quant data that we can look at patterns and then respond to those patterns. Right? And I say it's not that we get rid of traditional decision making, we feed it better, but we need photographs so a nurse can take a picture of a patient, record a patient's story, and type notes. If a maintenance worker is in a house, if I look at the work we're doing on abuse, for example, at the moment with social workers, the social worker can allow somebody to tell their story and interpret their own story on a house visit, rather than be reliant on the social worker writing something up from memory 2 or 3 weeks later. So you need a much richer data source, but the key thing on data analytics is not the data, it's who interprets it. And you need the people who create the data to interpret it, not the expert, and God's sake, not an algorithm, right?
I'm trying to keep away from the algorithms in this DINCast here, but I think you touched on there around sort of experts, and I'd like to sort of get your views around sort of consultants and people bringing in, because obviously we live in a time where nobody's necessarily been here before, sort of post-COVID. So this does look to be quite a rich pickings time for some of the consultancies to come in and help organisations change. What's your thoughts around that?
You should always, there's a key question of any consultancy firm is what's the ratio between their partners and their consultants? So if it's about 1 to 3, 1 to 5, you've got an apprentice model. If it's 1 to 20, 1 to 30, you've got a manufacturing model, and they'll just apply a recipe, and that's a disaster. Right? The other thing is the danger of using the consultants to replace field knowledge. So that's my point. You need to hear from your tenants are actually consultants to their own condition. And they understand it at a hyper-local level, probably better than even an external consultant. Yeah. And the third thing, so I would avoid people with a very high partner to consultancy ratio with a formula. Formulas, recipes actually don't work. The other thing I would avoid is somebody who says, I've had one job and I've been hugely successful. I'm just going to copy that across here. That's another warning sign, right? Yet consultants need to have a broad background in multiple environments. And ideally, you want consultants who haven't just worked in the housing sector. Yeah, because there are ideas from outside of that work. Yeah, so I would be cautious, but I'd start with getting the problem definition done by your tenants and by your active workers, and then get consultants to help to devise micro solutions, but not macro solutions. The danger with big solutions is they get things wrong. What you want is lots of small things so you can see what's actually sustainable.
Yeah, I would concur with that, Dave. I think one sort of final sort of thought from yourself, particularly aimed at leaders, and that's who this DINCast will go to, is what do you think are the new skills that they're going to have to sort of acquire as we sort of leave the pandemic sort of period? And are there some things that, you mentioned this at the outset, are there some skills or things that they're never going to need again?
No, I don't think there's a single thing in any leadership book that I've seen which doesn't have value, but very little of it has reality. I mean, I've worked with C-level executives, all right? And the only thing I've ever seen in common is that they're arrogant, opinionated bastards who drive their ideas through, but I don't see that down as a leadership quality. What I see is a series of platitudes, all right, which kind of like, well, nobody can really disagree with those. So I think all of that stuff is cool, listen to it, make notes on it, whatever, right? The reality is, though, the role of the leader is to create processes, which means they don't have to make decisions. The fewer decisions you actually make, the better. And you learn that as you become more and more senior, right? Your real role is to link and connect and distribute decisions. And that's where we work, is how do you make that a process? Because you can't actually, leadership qualities radically change based on different contexts. There's no universal framework. So you need to see the leader as a sort of coalescent point in a network of decisions, rather than as a driver of decisions in a hierarchy.
Well, we've come to the end of our time today, Dave. We've covered a lot of ground there, and it's been a real pleasure getting your insights into this. We'll share your contact details with members when we send this out, so hopefully they can follow up. But I do hope we can perhaps do something again with yourself in the future as well. Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, sir.
Thanks.